Happy Wednesday! You're listening to Mama Murdered a Podcast. I'm your host, AB. And this week on Mama Murdered a Podcast, we're getting into part 3 of the Caylee and Casey Anthony case. And if you're like me and need a refresher from last week's episode, we basically just went over how many different relationships that Casey Anthony was in, either in the time leading up to, the time during, or the time after her almost 3-year-old daughter Caylee was missing for. And last week we went over a lot of the cell phone data from Casey's phone, and we also covered a lot of cell phone data as far as where her phone was pinging and what internet searches were being made on the Anthony home computer, where, of course, Casey and her daughter Caylee lived with Casey's parents and Caylee's grandparents, Cindy and George. We also got into the last time that Grandpa George claims to have seen little Caylee alive. And he was even able to remember the time and the date that he last saw Caylee. George was able to remember those small specific details based on a show that he loved and he watched pretty religiously, and he was even able to remember what little Caylee had been wearing the last time he saw her alive. So, Caylee comes in and tells her Grandpa George that she's going to spend the day with her nanny. And oddly enough, this nanny is named Zanny. So, when George last saw Caylee, and after this last encounter, when George Anthony said that his granddaughter Caylee told him that she was going to see Zanny the nanny, that would be the last time that George, or anyone else for that matter, saw Caylee alive again. But in the meantime, while everyone who knew Caylee and Casey were asking where Caylee had been and why Casey hadn't had her toddler with her recently, Casey always made everybody believe that Zanny the nanny was keeping Caylee, and most of the time, Casey was telling everybody that they were out doing all these super fun toddler field activities with this nanny who was taking care of her daughter Caylee. And eventually, after almost an entire month, people finally started asking the harder questions about why they hadn't seen little Caylee with her mother, Casey, in so long. And during the entire 31-day period of time that Caylee was missing for, and before any of the family members, friends, or even law enforcement ever actually realized that little Caylee was missing and in danger, Caylee's mom, Casey, had been out living her absolute best life for the entire 31 days. Doing all of that without her daughter Caylee being so much as a blip on her radar. So now that we've done a little bit of a refresher, if you haven't already, I would highly, highly, highly suggest that you jump back 2 episodes and listen to the first 2 parts, or else this is probably not going to make a whole lot of sense. So without further ado, let's get it. So the last day that we talked about was June 16th, 2008, which was the last day that little Caylee was seen alive by her Grandpa George. This was also the same day that George says that he remembered so much about, what was happening, including what little Caylee was wearing that day. And this was also the same day when Caylee told her Grandpa George that she was going to see Zanny the nanny. And now we're moving on to the next day. And the next day would be the day after little Caylee was last seen alive by her Grandpa George. So now we're on June 17th, 2008. And during this time, we know that Cindy and George were both able to be verified to be at work during a time where Casey's phone is pinging like she's at the Anthony's house. And Casey and Caylee both live at the Anthony house with George and Cindy Anthony. And then something that I find a little bit weird happens on June 17th. Casey's phone goes completely off the grid. All the way off the grid. As in, no calls were made or received. No ingoing or outgoing text, nothing at all between the approximate times of 5:20 p.m. and 8:20 p.m. And then at 8:23 p.m., Casey's phone is back pinging and live again. And when Casey's phone goes live again, it pings for the first time in nearly 3 hours, close to her boyfriend Tony's apartment. And I feel like nowadays, nobody's phone is completely off the grid for longer than 10 minutes for them to find a charger. Granted, this was 2008, but still. Now, on the next day, June 18th, Casey again goes back to the home of the Anthony family, and it was again when Casey knew for sure that Cindy and George would both be at work at the time that she showed up at the house. This would also be a time where Casey knew for sure that no one else would be home. Now, on the 18th, when Caylee gets to the Anthony house, she backs her car in and then asks a man named Brian, who is a neighbor of one of the Anthonys, and she asks Brian to borrow a shovel. Now, she asked him to borrow a shovel at about 1:30-ish on June 18th. So he lets Caylee borrow the shovel, and she brings the shovel back to the neighbor about an hour later. And the neighbor, Brian, says that Caylee didn't look gross or sweaty or out of breath or wore out. Like none of the typical things that you would think of when you think about using a shovel. Which is also just a little bit weird. What do you need a shovel for? Caylee's cell phone then shows that she was either at or around the Anthony house that same day between 2:30 and 3:30 p.m. The following day, on June 19th, there's not really a lot that happens besides Caylee posting online telling everyone that they should go to the nightclub that her boyfriend Tony promotes for, the next Friday on June 20th. And then the following day, on June 20th, is when Caylee is entered into the infamous hot body contest, which was literal days after Caylee was last seen alive. Because again, the last day anybody remembered seeing Caylee alive was on the 16th. So 4 days after, on June 20th, Caylee is entered into the hot body contest. And Caylee can be seen in pictures from this night, and she's dancing, taking shots, and looking just as happy as she's ever been. And these are the pictures that everyone has seen of Caylee in that cute blue dress, where she's dancing, laughing, and where she doesn't at all look like she's worried about her daughter, who she hasn't seen and who has been missing for 4 days. Like, how was she not at all worried about where Caylee was or what was going on with her? But during this entire time, and even up to months after Caylee was last seen, Caylee was selling the idea to everyone who was asking that she was paying this woman named Zanny to keep Caylee and be her nanny. But in order to pay a nanny, you have to have a job, and we have to keep in mind that Caylee doesn't have a job, and she hasn't had a job for years up to this point. Caylee just stole from anyone around her to get what she needed, so how in the actual fuck was she paying a nanny to keep Caylee? And again, let me just reiterate the fact that no one had ever actually met Zanny the nanny before, and I guess no one really questioned Caylee when she said that Caylee was with this nanny, which in all honesty, why would they? Caylee is Caylee's mom, like the one person who's supposed to protect her daughter against any and all of the evils in the world. Now, Caylee's mom, Cindy, was still calling Caylee damn near every day to try to check in on Caylee or talk to Caylee on the phone, like a very grandmotherly-like thing to do. And every time that Cindy asked to speak or to see Caylee had some elaborate reason why Caylee couldn't talk to Cindy right then. Caylee had even gone so far one time as to say that herself, Caylee, Zanny the nanny, and Zanny's sister, and another friend and co-worker of Caylee's were going to Tampa for the day to do something fun. Caylee doesn't have co-workers because she doesn't have a job. Caylee also doesn't have a nanny because she doesn't have a job. So how are they doing all this with all these people in Tampa? Anyways, Cindy tells Caylee to have fun, be safe, whatever. The very grandmotherly things that you would say. But Cindy does ask Caylee to have Caylee call her before bed when they're done with their, fun-filled day. And when Cindy never gets the call from Caylee to be able to talk to Caylee, of course Caylee's like, oh, Caylee just had so much fun, she's passed out. She just passed out before we ever got back to the room. Which is, again, believable. Then Caylee goes on to tell Cindy that they'd all had so much fun that they were just going to stay another day in Tampa, and however many nights this imaginary group of friends ended up imaginarily staying in Tampa with Caylee and Caylee is kind of irrelevant, because every time that Cindy asks about Caylee makes up some excuse until she finally tells her mom that this whole group was headed back home. So, of course, Cindy is excited to finally be able to get to see Caylee. She hasn't seen her in days up to this point, which is a pretty long time for Cindy, especially considering that both Caylee and Caylee lived with Cindy and George full time. But while they're on their way home from Tampa, from this imaginary trip to Tampa with these imaginary people, Caylee then makes up this huge and even more elaborate lie. Either later that day or the next day, telling her mom Cindy that Zanny the nanny and everybody who had been riding in the car with her while Caylee and Caylee were following her along behind the car while everybody was on their way home from Tampa, everybody that had been in Zanny's car had gotten into this huge wreck, and that they had to stay at the hospital in Tampa. So Zanny the nanny and everyone had been in this, huge car wreck. And then Caylee takes it even a little bit further, and she tells Cindy that Zanny's sister had broken her arm during the wreck, Zanny had gotten a concussion, like all this crazy shit. And I'm really curious how Caylee was able to keep up with all of these fake people and their fake trips and their fake injuries and all the other unnecessary fake shit that Caylee always makes up to make her life sound more believable. Like, I would not be able to keep up with that many names and injuries and places and dates. Like, there's no way. And I damn sure know I wouldn't be able to keep up with all the fake injuries that she's assigned to all these random people. But what's even funnier than this is the fact that during this fake Tampa trip, Casey's phone is still pinging at the Anthony's house, but only when Cindy and George are still at work. So Casey's still going home where she lives with her parents, but only when she knows for sure that Cindy and George would be gone in at work. And when Caylee had first told Cindy about this trip that they were taking to Tampa, Cindy had even asked Caylee if she and Caylee would be stopping by the house to get clothes for Caylee. And Caylee assured Cindy that Zanny always had extra clothes for Caylee because, duh, she is Kaylee's fake nanny after all. And even though Caylee was supposed to be on this imaginary trip to Tampa, she was still magically able to go to her house while Cindy and George were at work and steal gas cans from her dad George's shed. Tony drove Caylee to her parents' house because Caylee had ran her car out of gas because it's really hard to have gas money with no job. Anyways, Tony says that when they pulled up to George's shed that Caylee got out, broke the lock off the door, and took the gas jugs. Tony then took Caylee back to her car that was sitting on empty, and Caylee put the gas that she'd stolen from her dad into her car and then went on about her day. And then, because sometimes life's funny like that, it was the very next day that George went out to get his lawnmower out. He was going to cut the grass, and he sees that the lock on his shed had been broken off, and then he sees that all of his gas jugs were also missing too. And George didn't really think much about it at the time, but he did report it to the police, and George even kind of warned his neighbors that someone had been breaking into sheds and stealing stuff. And like I said, George didn't really think much about it at the time. Like, these things happen sometimes, but the more he thought about it, the more he kind of suspected that it might have probably, most likely, have been Caylee. So on the next day, June 24th, George is home from work, and this is a day that he would have normally been at work for. So Caylee shows up at the house, and Casey's been super careful to only go home when she knew her parents would be at work. And since Caylee had been actively dodging both of her parents, she didn't know that George had taken June 24th off to go to another job interview at a different place. So when Caylee goes inside the house, George is like, "Hey, long time no see. How's Caylee? How's work? How's life? How you been?" And Caylee tells him that she only has a few minutes, everyone's fine, everything is fine, and that she has to hurry up so she can get back to work. So George was kind of thinking that Caylee was probably the one that stole his gas jugs. So he tells Caylee, like, "Hey, I think I left something in your trunk. I'm going to run out and grab it before you leave." And Caylee starts in with the, "Oh, I'll get it, I'll grab it, I'll get it, I'll grab it, don't worry about it." And George is kind of ignoring her and still walking towards the trunk of the car. When he goes to open the trunk, though, Caylee kind of lifts the trunk up real quick and gets the gas jugs out that she'd stolen from him, throws them down at his feet, and then tells him, like, "Here's your fucking gas jugs, Dad." Which, rude. You stole them, first of all. I think it's raining. Y'all may be able to hear that. I'm sorry. And then on June 27th, something that seems kind of important to me, and it might seem important to anyone who doesn't know this story later on as we get further into this case. But on June 27th, Caylee runs out of gas again, and this time she texts her best friend Amy. And she tells Amy that she thinks her gas gauge is broken, and then Caylee tells Amy that she thinks she must have hit an animal. Caylee tells Amy that her car smells awful and that she thinks they're like pieces of a dead animal stuck in the front bumper of her car somewhere because her car smells so bad. And this is the first time that Caylee brings up to somebody else that her car smells like there's something dead inside of it. And that will be important later as we get deeper into the lie that is Casey Anthony. But either way, Caylee is admitting to people now that her car smells like literal death. And I guess Amy didn't bring Caylee any gas or gas money because Caylee called Tony to come and pick her up. And then she just left her car sitting in the parking lot where she'd run out of gas at. Now, mind you, this isn't Casey's car, not really. It's Cindy and George's car. Casey didn't pay for any part of this car. Her parents just kind of figured that Casey would need a car to be able to take Caylee back and forth to doctor's appointments, and that Casey would probably need a car to get back and forth to her fake job, things like that. So Cindy and George were nice enough to just let her have free range of this extra car that they had. Casey was able to take the car anywhere, anytime, any place, for any reason that she wanted or needed to go. Basically, Cindy and George had kind of just given the car to her. Like, she wasn't having to share the car with either one of her parents or anything like that. And I think that's, like, super generous of her parents, because from my understanding, Cindy and George figured that Casey wouldn't have such a hard time making sure that she and Caylee were taken care of, and that Casey had a way to get everything that her or Caylee may need. If they just gave her the extra car that they had, that would be one less thing for Casey to have to worry about. This would kind of give Casey a leg up in life. Because if you don't have to worry about buying a car, then you can kind of worry about other things like going to work and getting back and forth and saving up money to get your own place, moving out, grown-up things, you know. So I don't know why she thought it would be okay to leave a car that she did not pay for sitting in a parking lot somewhere with not even so much as a drop of gas in it. And then it just baffles me that she doesn't think to say anything to anybody about leaving this car in the parking lot. Like, Casey didn't bother to tell her mom Cindy or her dad George that she'd left their car that they were nice enough to let her use in the parking lot somewhere out of gas. But Casey also didn't say anything to an employee or a manager of the building where she left her car at. So this business had no idea whose car this was or why it was there, but they did let the car sit there for a few days before they called to have a car towing company come out and impound it, and the car got impounded on June 30th. So this was a few days of this business letting the car sit, which in my experience is a pretty long time. Normally it's the next day and they tow it, it's gone. It seems like they kind of let the car sit to give the owner of the car time to come and get it, especially considering Casey didn't say a word to anybody that worked there about leaving the car there. So the car was towed on June 30th. But inside the car, Casey left her purse sitting in the car. She also left Caylee's car seat in the back seat of the car strapped in, which I also find both of these things super weird. Why would you leave your kid's car seat in the back of a car if you knew you were just going to leave the car sitting there? Probably because she knew that she wasn't going to need Caylee's car seat anymore. As sad as that is to say, it's probably true. And then, why would she leave her purse? I take my purse literally everywhere, so maybe that's just because I do that I don't get this. I would never leave my purse. And at this point, we're at about 2 weeks now since anybody has seen Caylee. But at about the 2-week mark, Cindy had taken some time. Lord, that was But at about the 2-week mark, Cindy had taken, oh my God. Cindy took some time off of work. She was using her vacation days, and she's blowing Casey's phone up, trying to pick Caylee up and spend a few days with her, especially since she hadn't seen Caylee in weeks, and since Cindy had these free days off of work, she wanted to spend them with Caylee. And when she gets a hold of Casey, Casey tells Cindy that Caylee is with Zanny, and that they're doing some kind of themed breakfast type of thing, where you eat with your favorite characters at Universal Studios, and that they'd probably be there all day. So what does Cindy do? She drives to Universal, and she's just going to pick Caylee up from Zanny and take Caylee to spend the day with her and George. But when Cindy gets to Universal, she calls Casey to ask where Zanny and Caylee are. Casey tells Cindy that they're not actually at the character breakfast like she said they were, that they were actually still in Tampa. Like, what? I don't know how Cindy missed all these red flags. Also, why does Casey lie so much? It's like astounding how easily she can just lie at the drop of a hat. And this was just the first time that Cindy would show up to different places throughout her vacation time off of work. And Cindy was showing up to these places where Casey was telling her that Caylee would be with Zanny the nanny. So Casey just had Cindy out here riding around to different parks, theme parks, Universal Studios, restaurants, all while Casey knew full well that Cindy wasn't going to find Caylee at any of those places and that Caylee wasn't with Zanny the nanny. Now, this same week, Casey's boyfriend Tony was going to visit family, and he had Casey drop him off at the airport. He told her that she could use his car while he was gone. So everything is still just working in favor of Casey and her monstrous web of lies. She ditched the car that her parents gave her, and now she can use her boyfriend's car while he's out of town. But Casey had basically been living with Tony because, she has to avoid her parents since she doesn't have Caylee with her. So while Tony's gone, Casey doesn't really have anywhere to stay the night. And even though Casey hadn't really seen her best friend Amy in a while, she uses people to get anywhere that she wants or needs in life. So while Tony's gone, you guessed it, Casey made her best friend Amy's house feel like home for the entire week that Tony was gone out of town. And while Tony was out of town for the week, Casey hung out with Jesse at his house. Remember Jesse Grund, the guy who tried to be Caylee's dad, and Casey was like, nah, that's okay. So Casey hangs out with him for a few hours one day while Tony's out of town, and Jesse's asking Casey where Caylee is, because Jesse's completely in love with Caylee, and he probably misses spending time with her. But Casey feeds Jesse those same lies about Zanny having Caylee out on some toddler fun-filled day, and Jesse doesn't really push the matter. And then it was on July 2nd when Casey gets a tattoo on her left shoulder on the back part of her shoulder. The tattoo says La Bella Vita, which translates to Italian to say the beautiful life. And according to the guy that did this tattoo for Casey, he says that Casey didn't seem panicked, that she didn't mention that her almost 3-year-old daughter had been missing for weeks, or anything of the sorts like that while he was doing her tattoo. She did mention her boyfriend Tony, though, but no mention of her daughter Caylee. Now, Cindy's getting pretty fed up with Casey and her mounds of lies at this point, and Cindy gets Casey's brother Lee to call some of Casey's friends, and Cindy wants Lee to get an idea of where Casey will be on what day at what time, so that she can finally just confront the situation head on. But the friend that Lee talked to about Casey and where she would be, this friend ended up, telling Casey, hey, I talked to your brother, and he was asking where you would be, and, he seems like he's pretty worried about you. He was asking for your mom, what have you. So, of course, now that Casey knows that her mom and brother are going to be at this certain spot where she was supposed to be, Casey just doesn't go to that spot. That way she avoids being confronted. Remember, this was a trait from Casey even as far back as high school. Even people in high school said that if Casey thought you were going to confront her about something, that she would just vanish. So this isn't anything new for Casey. Casey was able to duck and dodge her mom Cindy and her brother Lee again. So Cindy takes another step in the right direction as far as locating Caylee goes. I mean, she still hasn't called the police to report Caylee missing yet, but she takes a step in the right direction nonetheless. Because on July 3rd, Cindy makes her very own account on MySpace, and she makes a post about her granddaughter Caylee being missing with her mood listed as distraught. This first post that Cindy made on MySpace was extremely long, and it's basically just Cindy telling everyone on MySpace how much she's done for Casey and how much she's helped with Caylee, and it gives me really, poor, pitiful me vibes, if I'm being honest. And it's even kind of weird the way that Cindy refers to everyone throughout the entire post. Cindy kept referring to herself as the grandmother or the mother throughout the entire thing. And then she would refer to Casey as either the mother or the daughter, and refer to Caylee as either the daughter or the granddaughter. It was really weird, very childlike, and feels icky to read, so I'm not going to read that. Y'all can find it online if you want to read it. But just know that if it was important, I would have read it here for you. On July 4th, Cindy texts Casey to see if she and Caylee want to come over and watch the fireworks with her and George. And Casey's dumbass is like, Mom, gosh, I already told you, we're not even in town, jeez. We're hanging out with my ex-boyfriend Jeff in Jacksonville, Florida. I don't know why I got the Napoleon Dynamite vibes there, but meanwhile, Casey is not in Jacksonville, Florida. Caylee is not with her, and this is all a lie. Casey is actually just hanging out with her best friend Amy and a crowd of people from their friend group for the 4th of July. And at this point, Casey is actively telling people that if they see her mom's MySpace post, just not to worry about it. It's just her mom trying to start drama, trying to control her life, whatever. And then when her friends start asking, well, where is Caylee, though? Because Caylee hadn't been with Casey for weeks and weeks now, and Casey was usually the mom that took Caylee everywhere with her, even to friends' houses and like adult parties and things like that. And now all of a sudden, Caylee is just always with this Zanny the Nanny woman. And of course, Casey tells her friends that Zanny took Caylee to SeaWorld or, all these like super fun, elaborate, touristy places in Florida. Now, while Casey's watching fireworks at this 4th of July party, she gets a call from Tony, and Tony tells Casey that he may be moving back to New York soon, but that he'll be home tomorrow and they can talk more about it then. So, naturally, Casey's upset because she has to have her head up some guy's ass all the time, and right now, her infatuation is with Tony. She's not worried about her daughter, but she's worried about Tony and him having to move back to New York. So, if Tony's going to have to move back to New York, that would leave Casey boyfriendless. But have no fear, because there's a new guy named Will, and he's really into Casey, and if Tony's going to move back to New York soon, then Casey needs to get her shit together and line up a new boyfriend with his own house and his own car. So, Casey's set to pick her boyfriend Tony up at the airport that evening, but she literally spends the entire day either with Will or on the phone with Will. And I mean that she was on the phone with Will all the way up until she met Tony at the airport. And I mean like down to the last literal second that she could possibly wait to hang up with Will is when she decided to hang up. So Casey picks Tony up and the two go to Buffalo Wild Wings and then they go back to Tony's place. Casey's supposed to be spending the night at Tony's house that night. Now, this night is important because this is the first of many nights that Tony recognized and noticed that Casey was starting to have these, like, really awful nightmares. Tony says that he had never seen or witnessed Casey have nightmares before this, and that one night after Casey had picked him up from the airport from his trip visiting family, that Tony had woken up to Casey sitting Indian style on the floor, like cross-legged. She's sobbing, and she's watching a video of little Caylee. And I think this is more telling than people like to believe. Because after Tony woke up the night that he found Casey sitting on the floor crying, watching a video of Caylee, Casey started to sleep a lot less often. She couldn't fall asleep. She couldn't stay asleep. And when she did finally go to sleep, she would wake Tony up some nights in her sleep because she would be covered in cold sweats and shaking super uncomfortably in her sleep. And it was bad enough that the shaking itself would wake Tony up. So what is haunting her in her sleep? It's got to be something, and it's got to be something that just recently happened if these nightmares just started. That's all I'm saying. So then on July 6th, Cindy tries another way to get Casey to bring Caylee over to the house so that they can all hang out. And Cindy thought that this would be a good time because Casey and Caylee were supposedly supposed to be back from visiting Casey's ex-boyfriend Jeff in Jacksonville by now. Because Casey had to think of something when her mom called and asked if they wanted to come over for the 4th of July. So Casey went with the lie that she and Caylee had went to visit her ex-boyfriend Jeff in Jacksonville, even though she was right up the road. So Casey tells Cindy that her car had been having trouble while they were visiting Jeff in Jacksonville, and Jeff was paying to get her car fixed. So, Casey tells Cindy that it'll have to be after they get back from Jacksonville, because they're going to have to stay and wait for Casey's car to be fixed. And meanwhile, Casey's car is actually in an impound lot somewhere, and she's nowhere near Jacksonville. But nobody knows about the car being impounded yet, and obviously Cindy and George don't know that she's not in Jacksonville either. So on July 7th, Casey runs into an old friend, and this friend says when they got to talking and they ask, how Caylee was and where she was, Casey just tells them that Caylee's doing good and that she's hanging out with another mom friend and on a play date, something, whatever. And things just keep getting more screwed up and screwed up and screwed up from here because Casey had planned to go on a trip to Puerto Rico with her best friend Amy and a few other people. But of course, Casey doesn't have a job, so she doesn't have the money to go all the way to flipping Puerto Rico with anyone for any reason for any amount of time. But Casey just loves to lie, so she'd been telling Amy and all of her other friends that she was still going, but that she would have to meet them there a few days later than expected. So on July 8th, Amy gets Casey to drop her off at the airport, and Amy leaves her car with Casey to use until she meets up with them in Puerto Rico. So Amy and all of Casey's other friends board the flight for the trip, and they leave Casey behind. And since Amy was under the impression that Casey would be meeting them in just a few days in Puerto Rico, she just let Casey use her car, and Amy figured she would pick her car up at the airport when they all got back after Casey joined them a few days late. And Amy was a good friend because she even filled the damn car up before she got on the plane, which, of course, Amy would have no reason to not fill her own car up with gas, I guess. And usually, if you borrow somebody else's car for whatever reason, you fill it back up when you take it back to them, or at the very least, replace the gas that you used. But Casey didn't have any intentions on meeting up with her friends in Puerto Rico because, duh, she's broke, lying, jobless, and a piece of shit. So at about lunchtime on July 8th, just shortly after Casey had dropped Amy off at the airport, Casey gets Amy's checkbook out of her car. And Casey just goes absolutely crazy, spending money out of her supposed best friend's account. Casey would steal and spend hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars out of her supposed best friend Amy's account while Amy was on vacation in Puerto Rico and while Amy was nice enough to let Casey use her car while she was gone. But again, Casey never told Amy that she wasn't going to make it to Puerto Rico, though, because Casey refuses to be confronted about anything at all, and she will deny until the day that she dies. Casey will take all of her lies to the grave with her, and I'm sure of that. So, 2 days after Amy and everyone else were already in Puerto Rico, Casey texts Amy on July 10th telling her that she was looking into a flight to meet up with them, and as we all guessed, that was a lie. And let me just remind you that Casey's mom, Cindy, still thinks that Casey and Caylee are in Jacksonville with Casey's ex-boyfriend, Jeff, who's paying to have Casey's car fixed. And Amy and all of Casey's other friends think that Casey is looking into flights to meet up with them in Puerto Rico. Both of those scenarios are a lie. And every time Cindy calls Casey, Casey tells her that they're going to dinner that night, and they're doing this and they're doing that on that day, and that Casey's car's still in the shop, and that her and Caylee would be on their way home just as soon as the car got fixed. Which is, again, a lie. So, Amy and a few of the other friends, they all think that Casey's meeting them in Puerto Rico, and Cindy and George think that Caylee and Casey are together and both in Jacksonville, waiting on Casey's car to be repaired. Like I said, I don't know how Casey was even able to keep all of these elaborate lies together and believable, because she was just feeding so many different lies to so many different people, and she was doing it for so long. Anyways, over the next few days, Casey would write check after check after check out of her best friend Amy's account. And Casey just basically buys and spends more and more and more of Amy's money while Amy's still in Puerto Rico. And this is supposedly Casey's best friend. On July 12th, not much worth mentioning happens, except that Casey is still doing the same old Casey shit. The only noteworthy thing is that Casey's mom, Cindy, did believe that both Caylee and Caylee were coming home from Jacksonville either on the 11th or the 12th of July. So Cindy is expecting to see Caylee when they get back from this imaginary trip to Jacksonville. But then it's time for Casey and supposedly Caylee to be headed back home from Jacksonville when Casey has to make up yet another lie about why they were going to have to stay in Jacksonville for just a little bit longer. Because Casey really needs as much time as possible for everybody to think that her daughter Caylee is still alive and okay and with her. And then finally, all of Casey's lies and manipulation start showing their cracks on July 13th. Because on the 13th was the beginning of the end of the lies for Casey Anthony. So on the 13th, there was a notice that Cindy and George had gotten in the mail that said that they had a piece of registered mail at the post office that they needed to pick up. But neither one of them actually got around to picking it up at the post office until July 15th. So when George goes to the post office to get this registered letter that he and Cindy had gotten the notice about, the letter said that Casey's car was sitting in an impound lot and that it had been there since June 30th. And like I said, Cindy and George were nice enough to just kind of give Casey this car to drive like it was her own. But it was technically still in Cindy's name, which explains why they got the letter about their car being in the impound lot, even though it was basically Casey's car. So now the gig is up. Casey's cover story is blown. Because Cindy and George both thought that Casey and Caylee were in Jacksonville, so they have no idea where Casey and Caylee actually are now. When George gets to the impound lot, they wouldn't let him get the car because it was registered under Cindy's name. So Cindy had to bring the proof that the car belonged to her and, pay the impound fees, which were over $400. Because impound lots usually charge you by the day, and the car had been there for weeks. So once Cindy took care of that and paid the bill, George took his extra key to Casey's Pontiac Sunfire and unlocked the doors. And that is when the smell of literal death hit George in the face. Even the guy working at the impound lot that walked over to the car with George said that as soon as George unlocked the doors and opened it, that even he knew exactly what that smell was. It smelled like a dead body that had been decomposing, that had been sitting in Casey's car in the Florida heat for days. George goes to the trunk of the car, and he even later says that he said a little prayer to himself before he opened the trunk of the car. And he said that he kind of prayed that it wasn't his daughter Casey or his granddaughter Caylee that were the cause of the smell. But when he lifted the trunk, he found a bag with rotten pizza in it. Like the pizza had been sitting there so long that the bag had maggots in it. So George kind of wonders if maybe the rotten pizza and food in the trunk were the source of the smell. But need I remind you, George had been in law enforcement, so he would know what a dead body smells like. And George has to drive this car all the way home with the smell that's just like permeating throughout the car the entire time. And he even rode with the windows down to try to air the car out some. And once George gets Casey's car back home, he and Cindy are going through the car trying to figure out where their daughter and granddaughter have been for the last month. Cindy finds a few things of Caylee's and Casey's bag that she always carried out the door when she was leaving the house to go to her fake job every day. They also found a little backpack that George had seen Caylee wearing on the last day that he saw her alive. Cindy found some of Caylee's clothes in the car, and she threw them in the washer immediately, probably to try to get the smell out of them. And Cindy had no way of knowing that those clothes were most likely evidence of whatever happened to Caylee. So while Cindy's going through the car, she found a phone number written down on a piece of paper in the front seat under Casey's purse that she'd left in the car. And this number belonged to Casey's best friend, Amy. So Cindy's like, let me just call Amy and see if maybe she knows what the hell is going on with Casey. And to see if maybe she knows where Casey and Caylee really are. Because obviously now Cindy had put two and two together. And now she knows that Casey and Caylee are not actually in Jacksonville waiting on Casey's car to be fixed. Because Cindy now knows that the car had been sitting in the impound lot for weeks. And as far back as June 27th, Casey had admitted that her car smelled like something was either rotten in it or dead in it. Because remember when Casey ran out of gas and she tells Amy, that she thinks she hit something or, something along those lines because her car smelled like death. So the car smelled like this even before it was impounded, and that's by Casey's own admission. So Cindy and George finally know that everything that Casey's been saying was a lie. And it was on July 15th when they finally got Casey's car back from the impound lot. So for weeks after Caylee was last seen alive, every time somebody would ask where Caylee was or why they hadn't seen her around lately, because before June 16th when Caylee was last seen alive, Casey would take Caylee with her when she would go hang out with friends at their houses or when she would go out and hang out and spend the night at her boyfriend's house. Casey would take Caylee everywhere with her, and then all of a sudden, Casey's showing up alone at all these people's houses where they're all pretty used to Casey having Caylee with her. And now every time Casey shows up, she's alone. So it wasn't just friends of Casey's asking where Caylee was, it was also Cindy and George asking Casey why Caylee wasn't at this barbecue or this event or this family function or, whatever. And while they're going through this car, I mentioned that George is in law enforcement. He would know what a dead body smells like. But Cindy is a nurse. She would also know what a dead or decomposing body smells like. I'm going to just throw that out there. And from my understanding, Casey was staying over at friends' houses and her boyfriend's house pretty frequently. So it's not too far-fetched that maybe Cindy and George could go a week or so without ever laying eyes on Caylee. And then anytime anybody at all would ask, where Caylee was or where she had been, Casey was feeding them the same thing with Zanny had taken Caylee to the water park or Universal Studios or SeaWorld or, wherever. And this was almost always her answer to where Caylee was and why somebody hadn't seen her in so long. But Casey always made it sound like Zanny the nanny was just taking Caylee to do, the most fun things that you could possibly think to take a toddler to do in Orlando, Florida. And you'd be shocked to learn that this actually worked for 31 days. Casey was able to lie her way out of any of these hard questions about where Caylee was for 31 days. And for 31 days, Casey seemed to be living her best life, or at least that's the way the media portrayed her actions during these 31 days that Caylee was missing before anybody knew she was missing. Because up until this point, everybody thinks that Caylee's fine and that she's just been having, the best 3-year-old time with Zanny the nanny. And Casey was making it a point to stay gone from her parents' house where she lived. She would stay with other people overnight, and she pretty much just dodged her parents, Cindy and George, for the entire month. Probably because she knew that Cindy and George wouldn't buy the Zanny the nanny story, but maybe a time or two, and that Casey using that excuse for literally everything, as far as when people would ask her where Caylee was and how she was doing and so on and so forth. She knew Cindy and George would only buy Zanny the nanny's story once or twice. So when Casey would go to her parents' house, she always seemed to be there when she knew for sure that her parents wouldn't be home, or when she knew for sure that they'd be at work. Almost like she made it a point to only ever go home when she was 100% sure that her parents wouldn't be there. And then when Cindy and George would bring up the fact that they hadn't seen Caylee at the house in weeks, Casey would always just use the "I've just been working so much" excuse, and that would kind of shut them up. So Casey was clocking hella overtime for a bitch with no job, that's all I'm saying. But that's essentially how she was able to duck and dodge her parents and their questions for this long also. It was always a work excuse, or Casey saying that she was helping so-and-so or sleeping over at this friend's house or that friend's house. Because as we've all learned, Casey can lie instantly and she doesn't need time to think up a lie. She can just make one up and run with it. She spouts lies off like she's speaking gospel. But in reality, Casey was mainly spending the night at her boyfriend Tony's place with him and his roommates, and I'm not sure how she was able to stay there for free, but they did all say that Casey kind of acted like the mama bear of the house. She would cook for them all, clean for them all, whatever. But eventually, those excuses, lies, and dodging anyone that might ask where Caylee was, and ask why no one had seen her for so long, Cindy was eventually catching on. So Cindy took Amy's number that she'd found in the front seat of Casey's car, and she called Amy. But before we get to Cindy calling Amy to figure out what's really going on with Casey and Caylee, and to figure out where Caylee is, let me tell you what happened on that same day that Casey's car was found in an impound lot by Cindy and George on July 15th. Because it was also on July 15th that Amy and these other friends were returning home from Puerto Rico. And Amy texts Casey to let her know what time she'll need to be picked up from the airport after her flight. Amy made sure to let Casey know that she needed to be picked up between 2 and 3 p.m. from the airport. And Casey is such a good friend that she decides that she might as well spend literally all of her best friend's money before she gets back from vacation. Casey paid her bill with AT&T out of Amy's account. And tell me how Casey owed AT&T $575. That don't even make no sense, especially for the year 2008. Phones were like $20. Casey also wrote a check from Amy's bank account and cashed it. That check was for $250. But the check for over $500 that Casey had tried to pay her AT&T bill with, had bounced. Which just means that Casey had already spent literally every single cent in Amy's account already before she even ever tried to write this check for over $500. And Casey still had the nerve to go to the airport and pick up Amy and her other friends when they got off their flight back from Puerto Rico. And she did this in Amy's car that Amy was nice enough to let her borrow while she was gone. Even though that wasn't the plan at all, since Casey was supposed to have met them in Puerto Rico. But either way, she had the nerve to pick Amy up after she knew full well that she had just drained her bank account. A bank account that Amy had because she had a real job and worked for her money. But Amy doesn't realize that Casey has stolen all of her money yet. Not yet anyways. So after Casey picks Amy up from the airport, Amy drops Casey back off at Tony's place, and then Amy heads to the mall with the friends that she'd been on vacation with. So when Cindy calls Amy to see what the hell's going on with Casey, Amy has kind of figured out that Casey has been lying to everybody. She just doesn't know how badly she's been lying yet. And Amy does feel like something's going on with Casey, she just doesn't know what. Amy also doesn't know that Casey had cleaned her bank account out yet. So she tells Cindy that she does know where Casey is, and she tells Cindy that if she will pick her up at the mall, that she will take her to where Casey is at Tony's house. So, Tony's house is where Casey had been staying for the majority of the month. This would be a good place to start for Cindy. So Cindy picks Amy up at the mall, and they get to Tony's place. And Cindy is to the point where she's so fed up with Casey and her lies that when she knocks on the door at Tony's place, she basically tells Casey to get in the car, and she doesn't want to hear it. Like, I can see her doing this like you're talking to a toddler. Like, I said, get in the car. So they all three drop Amy off at her house, and now Amy had just been on vacation and shopping at the mall afterwards. She figured it would probably be a good idea to check her account balances. And Amy finds out that every cent that she had to her name was gone, and that no one else had access to her checks or her loose cash besides Casey. So that's where that friendship ends for the most part. Cindy has had enough of Casey's lies, and she's done with Casey's excuses on where Caylee is and why no one has seen her. Cindy finally gives up on fighting with Casey, and instead she drives to the police station. She has Casey in the car with her, and she's pressing charges on Casey for stealing the car. Even though Casey had been given free range to use the car for whatever, whenever, I feel like this was Cindy's way of just being like, tell me where Caylee is, or I'll have you locked up. It doesn't matter what I have to tell them. But Casey's just not budging. She's not giving up Caylee's location, and she's not giving Cindy any more information that Cindy can use to find Caylee. Now, unfortunately, the police station that Cindy had driven them to was closed. So instead, Cindy makes her first 911 call, which I told you that I wanted to replay these 911 calls when we got to this part in the timeline, because I feel like now that you know a lot more about the story and the case and what's going on, some of the verbiage and the phrases and tones that are used, you might pick up on a little more than you had before. So I'm going to play the first 911 call now.
Please, this sound is being recorded. How can I help you? Thank you. Hello.
Hi, I drove to the police department here on Pershing, but you guys are closed. I need to bring someone into the police department. Can you tell me where the closest one I can come into?
What are you trying to accomplish by bringing them to the station?
I have a 22-year-old person that has grand theft sitting in my auto with me.
So the 22-year-old person stole something?
Yes.
Is this a relative?
Yes.
Where did they steal it from?
My car and also money.
Okay, is this your son?
Daughter.
Okay, so your daughter stole money from your car?
No, my car was stolen. We retrieved it today. We found out where it was at. I retrieved it. I've got that, and I've got affidavit for my banking account. I want to bring her in. I want to press charges.
Where did all of this happen?
Oh, it's been happening.
No, but I need to establish a jurisdiction is what I'm trying to...
Oh, I lived in Orlando.
Yeah, but what address did these thefts occur at?
Well, I guess my residence, I guess.
Okay. That's actually going to be in the jurisdiction of the sheriff's office, ma'am, not the Orlando Police Department.
Alrighty.
Let me transfer you over to the communications section for Orange County.
Okay. Now, is the Orlando Sheriff's Department the one on 436, is that open this afternoon, this evening?
The substation you're at on Pershing, if it's Orlando Police, we're open primarily during the day.
Uh-huh.
But that's not the sheriff. That's the city police, which does not have jurisdiction for your
address. I know there's a sheriff's department on 436.
Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to transfer you to the sheriff's communications section, and you can determine that. Hold on.
Okay. Because my next thing will be down to trial thing, and we'll have a court order together. If that's what you want to play, we'll do it. And you'll never... Well, then you have it on Monday. No, I'm not giving you another day. I've given you a month. All right,
Okay, now during this first 911 call, you hear Cindy tell Casey something along the lines of, if this doesn't work, then we'll go to the child protection thing and get a court order to get her. And it sounds like Casey must have asked Cindy to give her another day to get Caylee, and Cindy tells her, like, no, I've given you a month to go get her. So obviously Cindy is aware already that Caylee is missing, or I don't think she would have said, no, I've given you a month already to go get her. So this is a little bit weird to me. But regardless, now Cindy and Casey are going back to Cindy and George's house to wait on the police to show up because Cindy is done playing. And while they're there, Casey's brother Lee shows up at the house. George had to go to work after he had gotten Casey's car out of the impound lot, but he's still keeping in touch with Cindy to try to figure out what's going on with Casey and to figure out where Caylee is. So it seems like George had actually asked Lee to go over to the house, and in my head I can see Cindy laying on the questioning like she's a trained FBI agent. But Casey's sticking to her lies, and she's sticking to all of them. The Zanny the Nanny lie, the lie about going to Tampa, the lie about Jacksonville, all of them. And after about 2 hours of time have passed since Cindy made the first 911 call, she calls 911 again. And this time the call starts with, I need someone to be arrested. And then she says, and possibly a missing child. Which again is weird. So I'm going to play the second 911 call here.
911, what is the address? What's happening? I have someone here that I need to be arrested in my home. They're there right now? A possible missing child. I have a 3-year-old that's been missing for a month. A 3-year-old? Yes. Have you reported that? I'm trying to do that now, ma'am. Okay, what did the person do that you need arrested? My daughter. For what? For stealing an auto and stealing money. I already spoke with someone. They said they would patch me through the Orlando Sheriff's Department, have a deputy here. I was in the car. I was going to drive her to the police station, and no one's open. They said they would bring a deputy to my home when I got home to call them. So she stole your vehicle? Yes. When did she do that? On the 30th. I just got it back from the impound. I'd like to speak to an officer. Can you have someone come out to my house? Okay. Okay, I gotta ask you these questions so I can put them in the call, okay? Okay. 30th of June? Yes. Okay, how old is your daughter? 22. Okay, what's her name? My name? Her name. Her name? And you said you have the vehicle back? Yes. I have the statement. She's there right now? Yes, I got it. I finally found her after a month. She's been missing for a month. I found her, but we can't find my granddaughter. 5'1.5". Thin, medium, or heavy build? Thin. Color hair? Brown. What color shirt is she wearing? White. What color pants? Oh, they're shorts. They're plaid. They're like pink and teal and white and black plaid. Does she have any weapons on her? No. Is he not telling you where her daughter is? Correct. Okay, we'll have a deputy out to you as soon as one's available, okay? Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
And eventually, between the second and third 911 call, Casey finally admits for the first time that she also hasn't seen Caylee in 31 days. So she hasn't seen her in 31 days, but Casey does say that she just talked to Caylee earlier that day, and that Caylee had called her from like an unlisted or blocked number. Casey says that she dropped Caylee off with Zanny the nanny 31 days ago, and that when she went to Zanny's to pick Caylee up later, that no one was there and that she'd been investigating Caylee's disappearance on her own for the last 31 days. And that's why she hadn't been around, because she's Inspector Gadget and she was going to find Caylee on her own. Duh. So she's been going to these clubs where Zanny had been known to go, and that Casey had been talking to these people at these clubs about Zanny and trying to figure out where Caylee was. And of course, after hearing all this, Cindy is in like a full-blown panicked frenzy. And she makes the third and final 911 call. And I'm going to play that for you now.
911, what's your emergency? I called a little bit ago. The deputy sheriff said I found out my granddaughter has been taken. She has been missing for a month. Her mother finally admitted that she's been missing. Okay, what is here now? Okay, what is the address that you're calling from? We're talking about a 3-year-old little girl. My daughter finally admitted that the baby's in the store. I need to find her. Your daughter admitted that the baby is where? That the babysitter took her a month ago that my daughter's been looking for. I told you my daughter was missing for a month. I just found her today, but I can't find my granddaughter. She just admitted to me that she's been trying to find her herself. There's something wrong. I found my daughter's car today, and it smells like there's been a dead body in the damn car. Okay, what is the 3-year-old's name? Caylee. Caylee. Anthony. Caylee Anthony? Yes. Okay, is she white, black, or Hispanic? She's white. How long has she been missing for? I have not seen her since the 7th of June. What is her date of birth? 8/9/2000. Oh God, she's 3. She's 2005. So it's Kaylee's missing. Kaylee's missing. Casey says Danny took her a month ago. She's been missing for a month. Okay, I understand. Can you calm down for me for just a minute? And I need to know what's going on, okay? I'm gonna try and talk. Is your daughter there? I'm on the phone with them. Is your daughter there? Yes. Can I speak with her? Do you mind if I speak with her? Thank you. I called them 2 hours ago. They haven't gotten here. Can you speak? Finally admitted to Danny took her a month ago. She's trying to find her. Ma'am. Okay, they want to talk to you. Answer the question. Hello? Yes. Hi. Well, can you tell me what's going on a little bit? I'm sorry? Can you tell me a little bit what's going on? My daughter's been missing for the last 31 days. And you know who has her? I know who has her. I've tried to contact her. I actually received a phone call today, now from a number that is no longer in service. I did get to speak to my daughter for about a minute. Okay, did you guys call and report a vehicle stolen? Yes, my mom did. Yep. Okay, so there's been a vehicle stolen too? No, this is my vehicle. What vehicle was stolen? It's a 98 Pontiac Sunfire. Okay, I have deputies on the way to you right now for that. But now your 3-year-old, okay, your 3-year-old daughter is missing. Caylee Anthony. Yes. White female. Anthony. Yes, white female. 3 years old, 8/9/2005, her date of birth? Yes. And you last saw her a month ago? 31 days. Some 31 days. Who has her? Do you have a name? Her name is Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez. Who is that? Babysitter? She's been my nanny for about 1.5 years, almost 2 years. Why are you calling now? Why didn't you call 31 days ago? I've been looking for her and have gone through other resources to try to find her, which is stupid. Okay. Can you give me the name of the nanny again? Like, spell it out for me? Zenaida, Zenaida. Last name? Fernandez. - Gonzalez. I think the officers are here. The officers are there? Yes. Okay, hold on a second. Don't hang up with me yet. I need you... Okay.
And during the time that Cindy's on the phone with the dispatcher and the time that Casey was on the phone with the dispatcher, they sound like two completely, different things as far as their levels of panic go. Like, Casey sounds like she'd rather be anywhere else, and Cindy sounds like she's a panicked parent or grandparent who's running through just this slew of possibilities of things that could be happening to Caylee or things that may have already happened to Caylee. Maybe Casey doesn't sound like she's worried about what's happening or what already might have happened to Caylee because she already knows exactly what happened to Caylee and exactly where Caylee is. Now, of course, the dispatcher has told responding officers that instead of going to a call about a stolen car by a family member, that they're now responding to the same address for a missing 3-year-old and a car that smells like there's been a dead body in the damn car. And they get there a lot quicker than they were planning to originally. And what they find will have to wait until next week. I'm sorry. I'm going to try to wrap this series up with the next episode, possibly 2 episodes being the last one on this series. And then I'm going to probably give us a break for a few weeks and cover some different cases before I go into the new Peacock show that Casey Anthony recently did. So, before we say let's do it again, go check out all my socials. It's either murdered_mama on Instagram and Twitter or Mama Murdered a Podcast on Facebook and TikTok. And you can even follow me on TikTok now and get a little bit of more of a glimpse into my personal life that you really don't get to see on the podcast side of the show. So if you want to do that, have fun. I'll try to follow you back. I'll try to make sure I follow everybody back. We'll see. If not, it's not personal. It's just my ADD. Actually, there's a video on TikTok right now that was posted today. As soon as I walked into the She Shed studio, I thought I was going to have to burn this building to the ground because there was a massive lizard in here. So, I almost busted my ass, almost burnt my building down, and you can find that on TikTok. So, next week we'll do part 3 of Casey Anthony, and hopefully there'll only be 4 parts. I'll try to chop it down to 3, but if there's stuff that doesn't need to be left out, I'm not going to leave it out, so it may be 4, we'll see. I hope you're enjoying this so far. Leave a good review on Apple if you have time. If you listen on Spotify, take a minute to rate it, 1 through 5 stars. Supposedly it helps people find the show. Apparently it's working because these downloads are going crazy, y'all. I'm amazed. Literally amazed. All right, so let's do it again. Same time, same place, next Wednesday. See you then.
That's how my mama murdered a podcast.